Thank you for coming. We're thrilled to have Muriel here with us and looking forward to her talk, which will be a talk and a walk through the exhibition. I'm really opened this exhibition on
Last Thursday.
I was going to say Friday, last Thursday, and it was organized by Dorota Bichelle, our former director. So she was our guest curator for this, and we'll hear more from Andre, who was very, very involved in the installation in all sorts of ways. And again, I'm delighted Stephanie is here as well. Thank you. And delighted that you're all here, and we look forward to hearing from Muriel, but first from Andre.
I feel like I should use this.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So thank you guys all for coming here. If you guys do not know who I am, my name is Andre Ramos Butter, and I am the Exhibitions and Programs Coordinator at the HCP.
I should have said that.
Oh, no, it's all good. So yeah, I'm the one that facilitates helping get the work up on the walls. So it's been quite a lengthy but beautiful process that we've gotten this work up and made this exhibition come to life. And so yeah, thank you guys all for being here today. So thank you guys all so much for joining us today at the Houston Center for Photography, of which lies on the traditional land of the Coahuiltecan tribe. We're here to celebrate Muriel Hasbun and her work that's in our current exhibition, which is Beyond the Record. And Muriel Hasbun's expertise as an artist and an educator focuses on issues of cultural identity, migration, and memory. Through an intergenerational, transnational, and transcultural lens, Hasbun constructs contemporary narratives and establishes a space for dialogue where individual and collective memories spark new questions about identity and place. Hasbun, is it moving?
It's good.
Is the recipient of numerous distinctions, including a 2014 Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, a Museums Connect grant of the U.S. Department of State and American Association of Museums, artists and residences at the Centro Cultural de España in San Salvador, and a Fulbright Scholar Grant. Her work has been internationally exhibited, and the venues include the Whitney Museum of American Art, the SWAB Barcelona, Centro Cultural de España in San Salvador, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Photo Fest, the 50th Venice Biennial, Centro de la Imagen,
Yes.
I'm aprendiendo español, in Mexico City. Similarly, her photographs are in numerous private and public collections, including the Art Museum of the Americas, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, University of Texas Austin, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Biblioteca Nacional de France. Building upon her socially engaged art and teaching practice, Muriel Hasbun is the founder and director of Labyrinto Projects, a transnational cultural memory and education initiative that fosters contemporary art practices, social inclusion, and dialogue in El Salvador and its U.S. diaspora. She is the 2021-22 Estelle Leibowitz Endowed Visiting Artist at Rutgers University, visiting artist with the Nomad MFA program at the Hartford Art School, and professor emerita at the GWU Conqueron School of Arts and Design. Previously, she was professor and chair of photography at the Conqueron College of Art and Design. Without further ado, and my little hiccups, Muriel Hasbun.
Thank you so much, Andre and Linda. Yeah, this is so amazing to be here. It's been a wild week. I've been, since the opening we installed, I guess, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday the opening, and it was lovely to see some of you, and it's great to have you here tonight. Also, yes, Stephanie, who's in the show as well, it's great, and Jessica, to be in dialogue with them. So the way that I think I would like to do this is to kind of go through the exhibition, and it kind of makes sense to start with the first work I did, which is in the other room. So if you'd like, we could go over there, and basically the work that you see here is 3 bodies of work and 1 video project. And they all kind of have this relationship to archives and to my kind of obsession to create a sense of what I call my terruño, or homeland, from a diaspora point of view. And so I'm going to try to let you know how it is that I started with that idea of trying to construct a sense of my homeland as having been born and raised in El Salvador, and then I came here when the Civil War started, and the Civil War in El Salvador, obviously, which spanned from 1980 to 1992. 75,000 people were killed, 8,000 people disappeared, and there's 2.5 million Salvadorans living in the United States now, and mostly because of that Civil War. So my work is definitely grounded in El Salvador, and so I just want to kind of give you a sense of what that's about. But it complicates the whole sense of like who is Salvadorian and how we talk about identity and cultural identity. Can we stand here? So the photographs that you see on the wall are part of a series called Santos y Sombras, or Saints and Shadows, which I did in the 90s. It's a body of work that I developed from like 1991 to 1997, 8, something like that. So it took a long time to do. It's 38 gelatin silver prints. They're all darkroom prints, and they're all, film. And they chart this journey of trying to figure out who I was. I came to the United States, like I said, in 1980, but in El Salvador, my parents are also immigrants, or come from immigrant families. So my father's family is Palestinian Christian. They were born in Bethlehem and went to El Salvador at the beginning of the 20th century when World War I started. So in 1909, the Ottoman Empire decided to change its draft laws, and all of a sudden everybody, including Jews and Christians, had to also join the army. So my grandfather and my great-grandfather at different time periods went to El Salvador escaping the Ottoman draft. And so they landed in El Salvador because there had been some migration before, and people had already found out in Bethlehem that it was a place that had open borders, and so they arrived there. And began their lives as kind of peddlers, like selling their wares through the territory. Sometimes people would go back to Bethlehem and then, once again start their journey. But in the case of my great-grandparents, my great-grandfather and my grandfather, they came and stayed. My mother's family is Jewish. They come from Poland originally, but went to France in the 30s. My mother was born in Paris as the Nazis entered Paris in 1940, and they're Jewish and Holocaust survivors. Most of the family died during the Holocaust in the camps. My mother had to hide in the central region of France, in the Auvergne, during World War II, and they, as a nuclear family, they survived. So my mother goes to El Salvador as an 18-year-old. She got a job as the governess, or like the teacher at the home of the French consul's children. So basically she was teaching them the French, with the French system, so that the kids could then go on to other French schools in different countries. So there she met my dad, the way they met is kind of fun. My father was a dentist, just starting his business, starting his practice, and the only dentist that would see my mom on New Year's Eve was my dad, and that's how they met. So, it turns out that then, this Palestinian, even though he was born in El Salvador, but, this Palestinian and this Jewish woman come together. And I grew up in El Salvador kind of trying to avoid anything about identity, trying to just blend in, you know. So the reason that I call this series that deals with my father's family, Todos los Santos, or All the Saints, is because the best way to assimilate and to not be seen or to not be pointed out was to be super Catholic. And that's through the work I realized that my grandparents or my family, you know, the Palestinian family, wasn't only Catholic, but they were also Greek Orthodox. And the way that I realized this is as I was doing research, research and asking my family members to share their family photos with me, because that was the best way to start a conversation, I realized that my grandmother, Elena, had 2 birth certificates. One was from the Greek Orthodox part of the church in Bethlehem, St. Catherine's in Bethlehem, that was in Greek and part of the Greek Orthodox Church. And the other one, this one, says that she was baptized under the Grecos Schismaticos, which is the Greek schismatics, according to the Roman Catholic Church. And the reason that that was asked for is because my grandmother was going to marry my grandfather, and they needed a document that said that she had been baptized, and and then she could be married in the Catholic Church. And so this is how I find out basically that half the family was Greek Orthodox. But because there was no Greek Orthodox church in El Salvador, that, just was kind of forgotten. But as I was photographing, and if you see this photograph here, as I kept asking to meet more family members that maybe my parents had not had much contact with, I went and visited the youngest sibling of my grandmother, who still lived in my great-grandparents' house. And I enter this room that my great-grandfather had built that was an altar. And he was a very devout Greek Orthodox man. And so there was this altar within, and all these photographs of all the dead relatives, along with, all of these artifacts. And there it is, there's my great-grandfather looking at me in that photograph. So I photographed there, and this is my grandmother, Elena. I'm kind of weaving these little tidbits of information that I began finding out as I was doing the work. And you see the volcano, the Volcán de Izalco, spewing a Greek Orthodox prayer written in Arabic calligraphy by my great-grandfather Constantino or Costa. And it says, "In the blissful and eternal happiness of heaven, in the name of the pure and immaculate Mother of true light and all the martyrs and saints, Amen." So it's an incredible, when I don't read Arabic, I don't speak Arabic, unfortunately. And so I had somebody translate it, and when they told me what it said, I was like, oh, this is such a gift from my great-grandfather. So all of these photographs are either made by putting 2 negatives together or double exposures, or when I shot it, I was seeing it somehow with layers, even though it was a straight shot. So that you get a sense of this kind of layered information and sensations. So that's the intent, at least. So the other side of my family, the Jewish side, is represented in solo una sombra, or only a shadow, with a question mark, because I grew up not knowing anything about that side of my family. And I knew that my mother was Jewish, but somehow it had nothing to do with me. It was one of those things that because I was raised Catholic, as you can see from my first communion photograph, I really didn't know what it meant to be Jewish. And even though in the Jewish tradition, religion is passed on by the mother. But as I was doing this work, kind of the same process, I would ask family members, do you have any photographs you can share with me? And that's why it took 10 years to make, basically, because I had to travel to all these different places in the world where they're all, living. My mother produced a little piece of paper with Esther's name and address, and this is Esther. And it turns out that both my grandfather on my mother's side and Esther believed that they were the only survivors of the family for years and years and years after the war, after World War II. And so in 1974, they found each other looking through lists of survivors and met and wrote to my mother. My grandfather wrote to my mother, I found a cousin, and my mother kind of forgot about it, but she remembered when I started to do this work and gave me that information. I wrote to Esther. Luckily, Esther still lived in the same place. She lived in Haifa. She had survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and had gone to Palestine after the war, basically to meet her sister, who was the eldest sister, because their father had told them, if you survive, go to Haifa to meet your sister, and we will meet there. Of course, she was the only one. And there she is, I was lucky enough to meet her and made a whole series of portraits. You can see more on my website. And also she was able to retrieve the family photo that linked her to her family, and she showed it to me and shared it. And it's also, and this is her mother, Faiga. And this is my grandmother's mother. So, whatever photographs I was able to retrieve, so these become part of this sort of memorial, which is part of that series. This is Esther's poems that she wrote in either Belsen or Auschwitz, I'm not sure. But she said she had found a little piece of paper and string, and one of the Nazi soldiers gave her a pen, and she was able to make a little book of poems. So all of this history, it's like we all have stories, we all have family histories. They're not always told, they're not always transmitted. But what is transmitted is the effects of all of that experience, and I grew up knowing that I had a complicated family history, knowing enough that I had to hide it from the world, and knowing enough that the world, the outside world was, thought that those people were enemies to each other, supposedly, right? And so for me, it was like incredibly hard to disclose who I was, and I just kind of pretended that I was like this, nice Catholic girl in El Salvador, because that was the easiest thing to do. But when I came to the United States, all of a sudden I realized that I was Latina, because people were calling me Latina, although Salvadorans would all look at me and say, you don't look Salvadoran. So, and then Americans would say, but you don't have an accent. So, there's like this whole thing of like the expectations of like who is who and what you're supposed to be. But in El Salvador, there was a lot of prejudice against Arabs, like there is in a lot of the world, because it was institutionalized. It was basically in 1932 and then 1933, there was a law that was passed prohibiting Arabs coming into the country. And my grandfather, who had already been there 20 years, had to sign up into this special register of foreigners. And the thumbprint that's on that photograph is from that document that says, special registry of foreigners and all the biographical information, etc. So anyway, so all of those things are, part of like what makes us who we are. And as I started to do this work was definitely like a watershed moment for me personally, as well as, the way that I interacted with the world, where I realized that as I became more comfortable in my own skin, I was able to say who I was, and I was able to kind of communicate all of these different stories and realize that people really appreciated hearing about my own family history because they also have an incredible family history to share. And so many, as I continued working, I continued to work on bodies of work that dealt with my mother's hiding experience, and then made other projects that were more interactive, which you can see on my website. But from there, maybe you have some questions now and we can move on to the next.
Carolina's husband said we would go on a pilgrimage. So the next day, we all went to the Museo de la Revolución. I had no idea what I was going to see there. Oh my God. I began looking at the pictures on the wall. There she was. My cousin, Jeanette. Comandante Filomena. I remember Jeanette as a real beauty. She had actually been a beauty queen in the town of Santa Tecla. I can see her long black hair as she floated down the palm-lined street. She was riding on the foot of a large 1970s car, wearing a red velvet dress and pearls around her neck.
Jeanette Samur Hasbun, and she had joined the guerrilla movement, the FMLN, when she was at university. She was like 10 years older than me. When I saw that photograph in this little museum in the eastern part of the country in Perkin, I immediately remembered that my dad had been asked to identify her body because he was a dentist. Unfortunately, Jeanette had not been his patient. So, in my text, I say that there was no record of her smile. Because my connection to her is basically an emotional one, so the smile is like not the same thing as the teeth. I made this video in homage to her and to her ideals, because obviously she had died because she was captured and killed. Tortured as well. She had been, she had died for her life, for her beliefs. And so I decided that because nobody was talking about her, there was this woman, this young woman, the eldest of, I think, 4 or 5, who the others were guys in the family, and she was the only woman. And so this was like a real tragedy, for the family. And but it was like this thing that was not talked about. And so I decided that she needed some sort of mourning homage, and remembrance. And so this is what I made. And then at the same time, when I made this video, my dad had just died, and I was packing his office and his house. And so there were all these, dental artifacts everywhere. And when I knew enough that I wanted to do something with these x-rays, but I didn't know what, and so I just packed them all and brought them back to DC, where I live. And a few years later, I decided to make this series called Ex Post Facto, which means after the fact. And it's from all of the x-rays of all of his patients. I decided to choose a selection of 32, which is how many teeth we have, and make these pictures. And for me, they're a meditation on how we absorb the experiences and the trauma that we live. And the question is basically, if we could see inside our bodies, what would it look like? And so these become, for me, kind of like landscapes, of internal landscapes of, of what we carry. So that's that. I also made this piece, which is an interactive piece where from one of the x-rays, which was mostly, this is all analog, right? Like they're little tiny x-rays. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but from one of the x-rays, which mostly was an x-ray of gum tissue, I made this photograph, which also has a card that's like a blank card. And I'm asking anybody who visits to reflect on your own experiences of migration and intergenerational grief or trauma or whatever it is, that how it is that we carry these things in our bodies, and either draw or write and cover this photograph. So Houston will be represented here, or visitors to Houston will be represented here. So I would like for you to contribute to this after we finish the talk. So, imprint your story on my photograph. Any questions before we move on to the next piece?
What would be the dates on these roughly? Any idea?
They would be anywhere from when my dad started practicing, which is like 1958, to the time of his death, which is 2004, sorry. So yeah, there's no, what I did is I made them anonymous actually, because I didn't want it to be specific, you know, and usually we think of the record of like how it is that people identify, how people are identified, you know, obviously because they have, you know, the teeth matches a name. But in this case, I wanted to kind of reverse that process and make this more collective, you know, make this more about all of us and not just the individual person. You know, these are not necessarily about one person, but rather enter into it as if you could see a landscape that kind of represents our internal, you know, subjectivity in a way. Yeah, and how it's recorded in our bodies.
And I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you alter the negative name, or did you change them? Did you have them
Nothing.
as is?
As is, yeah.
And the ones that are grouped, do they belong to the same person?
I would think so. Yes, I think so. Yeah, those are together. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, a dentist would figure out exactly what these things are, but I don't. So, yeah. Any other questions? I first printed them in the darkroom, but it was right at that cusp of when you could almost not get any more photographic paper. And I wanted them to kind of hark back to 19th century photography, landscape photography. So I then ended up scanning the x-rays and printing them digitally so that I could get the tonality and, you know, that kind of made you think of maybe 19th century landscape photography.
Yeah, it's in the printing process.
Yeah, but they're all as they are. None of the, like if they had scratches or whatever, sometimes I could see my father, like in this one, you see, actually my father's like had some pencil markings on here, like he, you know, because you,
Oh, yeah.
and so here, so it all stayed. Part of the record. Any other remarks or questions? So, Pulse, New Cultural Registers, which you see a selection of here, is my newest body of work. Also, that image over there is part of Pulse. These are like my mom, you know, like that's my dad and this is my mom. It's like this family thing. My mother owned an art gallery in El Salvador during the Civil War years and post-war years from 1977 till 2001. And this gallery, Galería El Laberinto, was the haven for artists and intellectuals of the time. It was an oasis for anybody who loved art. And so it was a really important place, you know. And the experience of being in the United States is that nobody knows about art in El Salvador, even art historians. They skip over Central America, usually, you know. So, because there are 2.3 million or more Salvadorans in the US, I think that we should all know a little bit about Salvadoran art history. And not only for those who are Salvadorans, but also the rest of us who, you know, are here. This is a continuation of my search for my terruño, homeland, which is in this case a metaphorical landscape registered or recorded by the seismic movements of the earth. So basically I have rephotographed the national seismic registers in El Salvador, and then in some cases overlaid them with images that other artists made or with my own photographs of the time. So I photographed mostly 1980s, the 1980s registers at the National Archives there. And so what you see is here, for example, this is a child that I photographed in the 1980s, early 80s, playing on the beach. Of course, it can be interpreted in many ways, but that's what that is. This is a more abstract look at that landscape. Exotismo al revés is a part of my mother's writings about an artist, about Rosamena Valenzuela. She said that those who were deemed exotic by Europeans are now the protagonists of her paintings. So in the late 80s, my mother was writing about exoticism, which I thought was amazing, especially given that she was a European woman. So I love that, having found that in her papers is great. This picture records the 1986 earthquake when I was in the US already and couldn't contact my parents for like 3 days because of the earthquake. And basically this earthquake, one of the artists of the gallery, Julio Sequeira, was getting his haircut in a building downtown San Salvador, and the building fell on top of him. He survived it, and I remember my dad making a picture of him coming out of the rubble. And so when I first was going to do something about the 1986 earthquake, I thought that I would put that photograph that my dad made. But then I started finding these strange kind of phantom images in the registers. And this one totally reminded me of a volcano spewing a spear or something like that. And it made me think of Julio's abstract paintings, which I overlaid here. And it's kind of wild that there's this spear coming out of, I don't know, some chemical movement in the paper, in the photographic paper that was used for the seismic register that now is in conversation with Julio's painting. The same with The Heart by Luis Lasso, and it's just another pulse that basically is part of our movement in this world and our being in this world. And the photograph that you see in the front here, No Registra Temblor, homage to Armando Campos, is No Registra Temblor means it doesn't register a tremor. Okay, so basically what it is something that is written on the register when the instrument fails. All of a sudden nothing is recorded. And so the question that I'm asking is, if the instrument fails, does it mean that there is no movement, right? And so I had a lot of fun making this picture and added Armando Campos's little ant like sneaking in to the frame. So that's basically my work here. And you're more than welcome to ask questions, and I'm really happy that, I'm also in conversation with two other artists who were born in the United States, and I wasn't sure, sorry. Born in the United States and have had this kind of experience through the experience of their parents, just like I had my experience with my own parents who moved to El Salvador and have had, kind of like experiences of migration and exile and trauma, and how it is that we process it and deal with it through our work and try to construct these more nuanced, complicated expressions of who we are. And so thank you very much.